Hello everyone and welcome back to Indian Genes. My guest today was awarded the Emerging Space Leader in 2017 by the International Astronautical Federation and was elected as a member of the International Institute of Space Law. He is a co-founder at SatSearch and founded his first company, Dhruva Space, way back in 2012. He has a PhD from the Frederick Alexander University in Germany and a master's in space technology from Sweden. In addition to this, he has a master's in space techniques and instrumentation from France. He has previously worked on research projects with the Indian Institute of Astrophysics and the DLR Institute of Space Systems in Germany. With a resume like that behind him, I don't think I could have got anybody more equipped to talk to us today about space, the future of space, technologies related to space, as well as opportunities that should be coming up in the private sector. He's very involved with ISRO. We do talk about that as well. We had a great time talking. This was one of my favorite interactions that I've had. So you're going to be in for a great time. And I now present to you my extremely engaging and very informative conversation with Narayan Prasad. Hi Narayan, and a very big welcome to you from Indian Genes. Thank you so much for sparing your time to be here with us. This, in a way, is a first of its kind for us here at Indian Genes because we do normally record directly from our studios, but because of the corona lockdown, we are trying virtual conferencing at the moment. So thank you for your patience. Narayan, as you know, that this podcast is aimed at promoting science and education, keeping people curious. A lot of our listeners are university students and non-experts. So we have a lot to ask you about space because I think this episode is quite timely with all the news that we've been reading recently. But before we get there, Narayan, tell us a little bit more about yourself. How did you get started and how did you get into this particular space?
Thank you very much, Joachim, for having me as a guest. It's a pleasure talking to you. To begin with, my story is not unlike many of the other space sector guys who had childhood dreams of having satellites and rockets built and so on. So I actually entered the space sector by accident because a few friends of mine asked a question that can we build kind of drones together, and we did that for a couple of years, and then an opportunity came by to work on a satellite mission with the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. And that was during my undergraduate days. And since then, space was something like a drug to me, and I got hooked to it. And for the last 10 years, I've been, working in this realm.
That's super cool. And you actually went from building drones directly to astrophysics. And I'm sure there's a lot that we can catch up about that journey. You also had something very interesting that you founded in 2012. Called Dhruva Space. Would you want to tell us a little bit more?
So what happened in 2012 is, as I said, during my undergraduate days, we were involved in these microsatellites or these small satellite projects with the Indian Institute of Astrophysics. And essentially, after that, I came here to Europe, where I studied in Germany, Sweden, and France. And along with a friend of mine, we thought, ISRO is not really building any of these small satellites. ISRO was building, satellites of the size of a bus, for example, or satellites of the size of several refrigerators put together. And essentially, we thought that these shoebox-sized satellites or small satellites was something that was very complementary to what ISRO was building. And there could be several interesting missions that one could build with such a form factor and several niche applications that could be done. And that was the reason why we kind of returned back to India after our studies and started Dhruva Space with the vision that we could be, the pioneers of building such a small spacecraft and get this revolution of having industry build complete satellites in India.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Very interesting. And especially because you mentioned a new space. I think the term, if I'm not mistaken, a lot of our listeners will probably get used to the term new space. But what is your understanding? Because I think new space was or is more of a movement or a philosophy talking about the global emerging private space industry. Is that how you guys at the expert levels also use this term?
Essentially, new space is a movement of moving away from the government and integrating yourself into businesses and markets. So traditionally, what has happened with the space sector, as you know, is militaries were involved in the very early days of space, and essentially the governments were the sole customers of space-related activities for a very, very long time. And even if you look at the Indian space program today, a lot of the activities is just industry working with the government in for procurement, and in most cases, ISRO or the government is the sole customer of the industry. And the whole idea of new space is that there is a market that is out there where people can do B2B kind of businesses or build applications that businesses can absorb or directly people can absorb. And the other bit is, of course, that the funding for this can come also privately, so that there is no government subsidy involved in the whole of the activities, so that it becomes a very well established industry, like, for example, how the aviation industry has established in the last 100 years.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, and we will come back to a little bit later, because just the opportunity that I see in the private sector for something like space is huge, because this is absolutely a new field that's going to open up to a lot of people who are going to be interested. And that's why I think this particular conversation is going to clear a lot of things for a lot of people listening in. And I think one of the best places maybe we could start for us to put ourselves to this is, we would like to understand, we do hear about space agencies, we hear about NASA, ISRO, ISR. What according to you is the current scenario? If you'd like to just break this down for a lot of my listeners, where does this compliance hierarchy of laws, legislations, who looks after this? Is there something for space? And how do government agencies operate within this environment?
Right, so that's a fairly complex question, so I'll try to break it down as simply as possible. Unlike many other laws and treaties, for example, many countries might agree that this is the border between my country and your country, although the border is not really visible to anyone out there, right? So it's an imaginary line that two countries agree that this is the border between us two. And unfortunately, nobody has agreed where space begins with officially in the entire world. So some people say it's 100 kilometers. Some people say there's some other definition to this, but there's been no international agreement on where space begins. And that's just the beginning of the problem when countries deal with space-related issues. Historically, for example, if an aircraft flew over your territory and you did not authorize the aircraft to fly over your territory, you could shoot it down. But in the 1950s, this was a legal challenge as well as a very complicated challenge in policy. If somebody would fly their satellite on your territory, I mean, any object that is in space will obviously fly over somebody else's territory for sure. Is that a threat that you're flying an object without somebody else's permission? That was a very big question in the 1950s. So these things are very unique to space, and today, people basically have agreed that space is kind of the common heritage of mankind, and people cannot appropriate that somebody who goes and plants their flag on the moon is theirs and nobody else's, and other celestial bodies, for example. So these things are now kind of the common heritage of mankind, and essentially people are trying to see how sustainably space can be utilized so that all countries benefit at the same time.
That's so interesting, because in a way you are saying that we are pretty much starting from a blank slate. So I think over the next few years, besides missions that are actually being planned or developments within private or government space agencies, I think the legislation part of it, if not got right at this very early stage, seems to be a very important factor as well, right? Because you've got to be able to control this. Like you said, if there's no border and we don't define some rules early, it could get you could get into areas that will be difficult to manage a little later on.
Right, absolutely. So there are, of course, the national laws are, within the boundaries of that country. For example, the US has passed a law that says anybody, for example, going to moon and can create some objects there, or is able to mine something of value there, can bring back to the earth and appropriate that and sell it, for example, right? And that's a law that US has passed on its own, and no other country has done that, and it applies to US companies. But there is no such law, for example, in India, and no other country in the world has taken such a radical step. So it really depends on what priorities do policymakers and lawmakers see around the world, and how aggressive they are about pursuing space as an industry.
Right, and you mentioned about the U.S. law, because I think recently they in line with that, they also passed a very interesting executive order where mining on the moon or space would be something they would oppose if it was another country. And I think India is probably one of the only 18 countries that signed this agreement somewhere in 1979, and Russia or China or US were not part of it. Do we need to relook at this agreement, or are we caught up in this?
Essentially, you are talking about the Moon Agreement, which is a part of the legacy of the international laws that were formed as a part of the early days of space exploration. The Moon Agreement essentially states that Moon is also like the common heritage of mankind, and people, for example, if they establish a base, all the countries have equal access to it, and if somebody is going to mine it, or do something on the moon, then everybody has equal access to it, and will be able to investigate. Those were very kind of overview level agreements that people thought that given that people stepped on the moon in the 1960s, that in 10 years time people will be living on the moon routinely. So, but then that did not happen. But during the time, the trajectory of the technology was so fast that they thought this was an interesting law to have, so that no country feels that they are left behind, or that somebody else or some bunch of countries are appropriating the moon without other countries having access to it.
Very interesting. And just sticking to the legislation part still, what currently do you think is the way forward? Of course, there has to be collaboration, because I think moving to space from here is going to be very difficult in the current scenario, or what we see coming up, if there's no collaboration. So what would your framework be?
So essentially, the major threat for space exploration is just collisions in space, and weapons in space, collisions in frequencies, and so on. So collisions in space can be solved by kind of having a very good picture of what is out there in outer space, and having technology that can enable countries to know where are the space objects more transparently. And that's something that is not present today. So, for example, objects of up to 5 centimeters big can be tracked by the US currently, and some other countries have that kind of capability too. But objects that are of lower size are very challenging to track. So, space debris is one of the biggest threat to space exploration, and that's where I see a lot of international collaboration needed, where we can know transparently where objects are there and how they're flying. This is also very well established in the aviation world, right? Because you have multiple countries collaborating between each other to know where an aircraft is flying, and they hand off each other between their own airspaces and so on. So countries can build capabilities in their own space, as in on land with radars and so on, and look at their part of space and kind of put a global picture of what is out there in outer space. The second bit, as I said, is about weapons in space and using space for military means. So if you start weaponizing space, and you start putting weapons of mass destruction, or even weapons that can destroy kind of satellites, then things start to escalate, and you will create a very hazardous environment in space, which may not be very conducive for commercial utility in the future. And it may also become very hard for somebody to escape the Earth's atmosphere to, the immediate Earth's boundary around space, and go into other planets or other asteroids or so on. So keeping it clean and keeping it for other entrepreneurs to come up with potential to explore moon and other places. That needs that the military aspect of space is limited, and it's mostly used for gathering information rather than to conduct tests that destroy satellites physically or so on. The third bit is, if you are using the satellites and your frequencies collide and you are shooting, lasers against each other or something like that. So the frequency bit is already quite controlled because you have the International Telecommunications Union that makes sure that two frequencies, the satellites were operating in the frequencies, they don't kind of interfere with each other or interfere with ground-based sources. That's quite well covered at the moment. But the first two are the major threats, I would say, for sustainability.
Right. And you did mention space debris as well. Is that at any level that we need to be worried about at the moment, or we have time before we can do what we are doing?
So the question is, how well do we know what is out there? Unfortunately, we don't have the answer for that because there's very little knowledge in the world today on what are the small pieces. So, for example, a few years ago, even a piece of paint hit the International Space Station, and a piece of paint, for example, is flying at 8 kilometers per second, and when it hits the International Space Station, it causes a leak in the pressure, and if just a fleck of paint can cause such damage, imagine what a piece of metal can do.
The next point that you were mentioning, and you were talking about the militarization of space or getting weapons out there. I don't know the kind of signal it also sends, because space is new to us, and if in our sequence of events it shows our intention and we start with military operations, that then tells us, are we exploring for military use? Are we exploring for socio-economic use, science, humanity? How does that, in sequence of moving forward, if we go in with militarization, let's say, of particular areas, in my own mind at the moment, I think that limits the ability for somebody to freely think outside what is possible.
Absolutely, you are 100% right. So again, the aviation world offers a very good parallel to us here. Because in the 1930s and the 40s, when aviation was looked at as a heavily military technology, you had a lot of innovation come into aircrafts, people trying to build long distance transatlantic aircraft that could carry bombs and drop these bombs. And after the World War II, you had all these military pilots who had the skill to fly aircraft, but essentially no real job because the war had settled, and you had this pool of talent and the technology available, right, for long distance travel. And that you see is how the commercial aircraft and commercial aviation took off. And today, I saw an image of, for example, a cabin from about 80 years ago. And it literally had like wooden chairs on which people would sit down, and nothing else there, and people would sit and smoke while the aircraft would move. But today the experience is a whole different lot, and you don't even feel like you're traveling anymore because the experience is so smooth. And that's where space has to mature as an industry. I would say what the aviation sector was in the 1930s or the 1940s is where we are seeing space as an industry today.
That's a great analogy. And taking form there, we do know that for collaborated missions to happen, let's say whether it's between Russia or the US or Japan or China or India or whatever, do we, like in aviation, we have English that is commonly used as, for example, the ATC in any country would communicate in that language because that has been defined as the aviation language. But that now that we are this early in space exploration, for example, you have people from two different countries probably on a mission. Is that a challenge? Is it something that has come up before, or do you see that can be overcome?
So it's an interesting question because it depends on the kind of mission. Because if it's a satellite that, for example, India is building with Japan, the engineers might have translators on the ground working with each other, where Indians are speaking English and the translators are translating between Indians speaking in English and the Japanese then translating it to their language, and essentially collaborate to build the satellite. but essentially operations are very seamless, where you see, just data coming in. The thing interesting about the aviation world is that it's a very people to people kind of communication business, where the handoff is not completely automated. It's not like today machines are handing off, taking off and landing of aircrafts, and the ATC and the people at the ATC are all machines. They're essentially people that are talking to each other. And as you said, English is established as a language. And for that, I think the parallel that you could see is, for example, in the International Space Station, where Americans and Russians collaborate heavily. Both of them try to learn each other's language so that there's seamless operation. So Russians, for example, don't want to give up their language because they have, they want to stick to Russian, and their local language is Russian, and they've been conducting space activities in Russian. And at the same time, Americans don't want to give up on English. So you see even the space suits having both English and Russian, for example, and all the manuals. Yeah. So essentially, in that case, there are two countries that have matched their skills and matched their capabilities. So you have two languages that have emerged. But in the aviation world, I guess the US was so far ahead that English became default, and a lot of the technology was transferred to other countries, and that made English the more preferred language. But it seems, we'll have to see how things go, and who will emerge in such scenario in the whole space scene.
True, very interesting. And like you mentioned, this probably is the initial days of space research. Do you have any interesting story for us? I mean, if we go earlier, I'll stay away from the current scenario. But I was reading something very interesting about Stephen Smith somewhere in 1930, who was actually looking at rockets. I think he was doing this somewhere in Bengal, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know if I got that fact right.
Yeah, absolutely. Since I just read that book last week, it's from a friend of mine called Gurbir, who is a British Indian. And he researched on this, and I didn't know by myself, even having been in the sector for 10 years in India, that a guy like Stephen Smith existed in the 1930s, and he was one of the sole experimenters on rockets in India. We all know, for example, Tipu Sultan was one of the pioneers of rockets, and after the Chinese, the Tipu Sultan was using these bamboo rockets against the British, and eventually the British took those rockets, and after Sir Tipu Sultan was defeated, they took those rockets and used it in the Napoleonic Wars, and that's how the rocket technology eventually landed up in Europe. But then it's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating
absolutely.
to see how, for example, in the 1930s, you had this guy, Stephen Smith, who was initially a police officer, and then, was a dentist. And then, he became passionate about aerophilately, where people would send mail, for example, using aircraft, and he would collect that. And eventually he thought rocket mail would become the normal, because for you to send a package from, let's say, Europe to India by air, it might have taken several days during that time. But he thought, eventually rockets will send these mail or carry these letters from Europe to India, or any place to any other place, within a matter of hours. And he wanted to be a pioneer in India in offering that kind of service. And he also saw that during disaster, during floods, or during other challenging geographies, one could use these rockets to transport food and resources to people who wanted it, and save several days or save several hours in providing them aid. So unfortunately, none of this is really well known in the in today's science communication realm in India. And I hope people have a look at these kind of lost characters in the whole Indian history.
Absolutely, that's so interesting, because, like you said, we are just getting into this new phase, or into this new stage at the moment, and these characters are so interesting. Just to get back to you mentioned what actually happened in the good old days and moving forward, and what are your thoughts on, for all this to happen, or for all this to take off, economic aspect of it? Because I think currently I was reading somewhere, a figure, I don't know if it's true, that it costs about $10,000 to get a single pound of mass into low Earth orbit. If that's the kind of money we're talking about, Is that, first of all, the kind of money we're talking about? And where do we generate this kind of capital from?
Yeah, again, since this is a topic that is hotly contested all the time, saying it costs a lot to get into space, one
Right.
could also look at, the established realm. Again, unfortunately, going back to the aviation world, the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
travelers that used aircraft were business people.
Correct.
Because business people could afford travel and they
Mhm.
wanted to get to places quickly, and they didn't mind paying a higher fare just because they saved time and energy in getting to a place and getting their business done and coming back. And only after maybe a decade or so, I guess, the whole aviation world moved from having business travelers to also having normal economy based or premium economy kind of fares. And today you see how much of that has reduced in terms of super economy and low cost airlines and all of these things. None of these existed 70 or 80 years back. It was basically business travelers saying there are 20 seats on this aircraft and I'm going to fly to from US to Europe, and I'm going to pay whatever so many $1,000 to get there, and I can afford to do that because I want to save time and not be on a ship for 2 months. So that's where again the space exploration is, because today, as you said, maybe 15 years ago, a kilogram would have costed $100,000 per kilogram to get to space. But today that's reduced to, let's say, $5,000 because of SpaceX and others. So there's a 20-fold decrease of cost per kilogram over the last 15 years. And so now the question is, if the industry matures and there's more flights that are happening, more things that are happening, and more demand coming, as was the case with the aviation world, do we see another 15-fold decrease in the next 15 years?
Just with space exploration, you'll have opportunities for a lot of other ancillary avenues. For example, space food or space suits is part of space travel. Things like you will have I think you need to have a whole new marketing concept to branding. So I think it's just not space or people who are directly involved in research and travel or exploration, but there will be a lot of ancillary support needed. And I think a great example for this is at the moment is NASA, because it's a brand on its own. The way NASA markets itself, if you get onto a NASA website and you look at the merchandise, you look at the high definition photographs that are available, they're engaging with people regularly on on social network. I was reading somewhere that Britney Spears they had actually roped in Britney Spears recently to promote one of their missions as well. So I think holistically, that's a great approach to take, because at some level you have got to get people involved. You've got to get people excited, because that's where the resource and the finance is ultimately going to come from, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. So it all depends on how the market evolves, because if we are stuck in governments telling us what to do and what not to do, and government saying we are the only controllers of all of these activities, then it might not go anywhere, because there's only so much money that any government can spend on an industry or keeping an industry alive. And let's say we had 70 years ago government saying only bureaucrats and diplomats can fly air travel, and we will not allow common people or businessmen to travel by air. How would the whole industry evolve?
I guess people like you and your colleagues in the field are trying to break out from, and whatever support you guys need from the rest of us will always be there. And getting back to Elon Musk and his SpaceX, and you have Bezos and Blue Origin as well. Can we spend a little bit of time trying to understand? We can start with Elon Musk and SpaceX. What exactly is happening with SpaceX? What is the idea behind that? How did he actually start? So a lot of people can listen to you and understand a little bit more, because otherwise there's bits and pieces coming out of what he's doing now. But if you would have to break this down.
Essentially, I think the story of SpaceX is of one that challenges the status quo of the industry and creates a leapfrogging kind of moment. And the leapfrogging kind of moment comes when you change the entire base of how technology operates to, change an order of magnitude in cost, and that's how you change the whole base. So, for example, right, the as I said, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, the cost per kilogram of a object to be sent into space was about $100,000. And if you have to change an order of magnitude of that, it's $100,000 to $10,000, and that's a very, very, very steep change that you have to make. And that cannot be made by just cutting cost, or moving the production to a lower cost base, or trying to do something else. But it comes by changing the base of technology, by which you can then derive this lower cost possible. And essentially what SpaceX did, and it realized, is that you could not sustain an industry by just flying rockets and losing them every single time, because every engine costs a lot of money to build. For example, the engine that NASA is now trying to build, the SLS, which is the biggest rocket in the world that people
Right.
will want to see fly. For example, they are paying, I think, $126 million per engine.
Wow. Per engine.
So per engine, that is, right? So that's a huge rocket that intends to carry people to moon and other places. But then you imagine, even you losing that engine. So you have, let's say, 4 engines there on your rocket, and essentially those engines are not going to be reused, so they'll go into space and they'll never come back, for example. So it's like every time you spend $500 million and you lose that, and it's the equivalent of sending an Airbus aircraft up into air, and you say this aircraft is never going to come back, and we're never going to use it. And
Wow.
how can you function as an industry if you say that every time I need to buy a new Airbus aircraft for ferrying, for example, my passengers, and never use it again? And so, which means that the cost of an air ticket, for example, is quite low, because the aviation industry and the airlines are using the aircraft again and again and again. There's hardly like half an hour between a crew changing, and then the pilots changing, and the new passengers stepping in, because you're just taking the time to just clean the aircraft while others step in, right? So
Right.
and and then it's a 24-hour kind of operation, where you're using the same aircraft between just 2 airports or whatever, multiple routes. And that's the logic, I guess, that SpaceX is trying to bring to the space sector, where essentially one would say that earlier, for the last 60 years, we've been flying rockets like Diwali rockets, where you just ignite them and you lose them every single time.
Yeah.
And then the whole idea now that the SpaceX guys and the others are trying to say is that we can learn a lot from the aviation industry and bring these rockets back and reuse them many times. Currently, these rockets are being used, let's say, 10 times reused. But what if you could use it 100 times or 1,000 times?
Wow. Oh, that just thinking of that and that kind of scaling, because yeah, I agree with you. I think that was what SpaceX originally started with as unique, reusing most of it. And it's interesting. I think the Falcon 9 rocket, if I'm not mistaken, is probably scheduled for liftoff somewhere within the next few days. Probably, I think that its first 19-hour journey with humans on board, right, or with astronauts on board, and they are taking them to the space station.
Yeah, absolutely. And imagine that a company like SpaceX, which is hardly maybe 20 years or something in the making, is beating a company like Boeing or Lockheed, who've been existing for 100 years in doing this.
Wow. And I think that's the Demo 2 mission. And is it true that they would be actually carrying astronauts to the space station, right?
Yeah, it's a crewed flight for the first time. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's the first of its kind. And how would you differentiate? Let's say I think we're quite you define SpaceX and why it's unique very clearly. What about Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos? Because these are two names that people tend to talk about in a binary way when we talk about currently about the space exploration. So how is Blue Origin different in what it's doing?
I think, Blue Origin has, of course, it's a rocket company which is very similar to SpaceX, but I think you have to view this in the larger realm of the whole Amazon business. Because, what Jeff Bezos is doing is he's owning a rocket company which is trying to build rockets, and he's also put in money into a project that wants to deliver internet from space all over the world.
Okay.
So these satellites need to be flown, and he might use his own company to fly these satellites. But essentially, what this might do is it might give connectivity infrastructure to the entire world. And of course, he has quite deep pockets. He in multiple interviews he said that he invests about $1 billion of his shares that he kind of sells every year in stock, so that he can keep funding Blue Origin. And it's like,
right,
a pet project that he funds so that the infrastructure is in place. But essentially, I guess, the view is that you are kind of creating the sea cables, the undersea cables, where people are going to connect. And because of that, you can see all this e-commerce marketplaces built and, all this commerce happening. And essentially, the view is that these satellites and this infrastructure that people are going to put up, like Jeff Bezos is planning to do, are the undersea cables between continents that will enable transactions to happen.
Wow. So that is the basis, or that is the original plan for Blue. That is the blueprint for Blue Origin. Yeah.
Yeah, essentially, and it's very interesting because there's a very interesting interview of Jeff Bezos where he talks about people, that the Earth is kind of very limited in its resources, and the number of people who can stay on Earth is all quite limited. And what if we had an ecosystem where we think about larger solar system and multiple interplanetary communities that are alive, and there's transactions happening between multiple interplanetary communities, and resources being exchanged and people trading, and people existing, and there's kind of an insurance against one place being destroyed by an asteroid or some other space impact and so on. So I guess these are all very, very, very far in the future. But they're kind of starting small with it. But essentially, the larger view is that you don't view just Earth as the only place that people can live. But essentially, there's more that we could do, and we could do as explorers. Create communities all over the solar system, and even outside of it.
Absolutely, and I think that's a given. We can all see that we are going to be a spacefaring race, and we will be moving to other planetary systems. But even like you spoke earlier, I'm just thinking about what you just said with Blue Origin and what you said about scaling and the way costs are coming down. I'm trying to connect your Dhruva mission on what you. Are we far away from in that case? I mean, if at the moment I own a company and I'm looking for data, I need to go through probably 3 or 4 levels. But somewhere in the future, I mean, I can look out at my house and I have a dish antenna on each roof now. Maybe every company would have their own satellite. If satellites can be built that way and cost is going the way it is, every company could have their own satellites and mine the data they want by themselves. Is that even a possibility?
Yeah, every company may not want to have its own satellite, but may use some kind of a space service. So, for example, let's say, I have an example. Last 2 years ago, I was in China, for example, right? And Disney had invested into a new theme park in China, and nobody knew how much investment was there going into it, and how well it did, and what would be, for example, its impact on Disney shares, for example, right? And essentially, the guys at one of the funds, the equity, investment funds, they used space data to map what are the lines in each of the, entertainment, whatever shows, where people could get on these rides, and they could see what are the lines there and match that with the individual prices of the thing. And with that, they could predict to a reasonable extent what is the economic activity and where would the profitability reach, so that they can make a decision on buy and sell of the shares.
Wow.
So essentially, it's about how you use space to your advantage and to your business, and either deliver profit or deliver service to the society. So at the same time, for example, 2 years ago when there was the floods in Kerala, the government there used satellite data from all over the world to create a risk map to know where are the floods hitting people the most. And because the state has limited resources, it has, let's say, 80 helicopters, rescue helicopters, you, without having on the ground information as to where are the people most affected, you can't make a decision on where to send those helicopters, because essentially you will be then just shooting in the dark, hoping that there's people wherever you send those helicopters, right? So satellites can be those eyes then, and say these are the hot zones, this is where you need to send these assets. So that's a societal application.
Yeah, that's so interesting you mentioned that, because I think there's a great current example for what you just said, because I think satellite data was also used to monitor China's recovery from the current coronavirus recession, if I'm not mistaken. They were using that data to actually see how China was doing. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that people have been trying a lot, because it's also about, for example, food security. If if I could track how much grain is in the entire world, I could track if the food is going to be a shortage because of climate change over the coming years. It could be about minerals, for example. If I am trading in metal, in aluminum, for example, if I could track the ores, I could create an index for what would be the price of aluminum, and look at making business decision on top. People use satellite data to look at how much oil is being produced, so that they can keep track of players in the oil market to see how much they are producing and selling.
Wow. And I'm sure a lot of us listening here are just amazed by the actual opportunities, thinking from a private business point of view. And at the same time, there's so much information that still needs to get out there. So why don't we talk a little bit about, you have been in something that you have been involved with, and ISRO. That's a great story for all of us, for I think globally, everybody looks at ISRO as something where you have a lot of high achievers. Resources could be limited, you could consider, but the results have just been stunning so far. So why don't you just tell us on what are your views with what ISRO is doing and the Chandrayaan mission? Anything interesting that our viewers would like to hear that they've not read or heard before? So you're the inside guy. Why don't you give us a little bit of information on that?
Sure. I think, ISRO, when you look at ISRO, it's a fascinating institution, because it's an institution unlike many of the institutions that we have in India, that was created after the Indian independence. It's an institution that was forced to, build its own technology and come up with the basis of it and innovate quite a lot. Of course, it had quite a lot of international collaboration that it also helped in the progress. But I think today, when you look at a lot of the ISRO activity, they're very good at a few things, and there's also quite a lot of room for improvement on a lot of things. So it's no mean feat to say that you are the first country in the world to fly a spacecraft to Mars in its first attempt and be successful with it. And that's a fascinating achievement, that almost no country was able to do it in the first attempt, and you could achieve that. So again, with ISRO, I think we have established a foundation in technology and a foundation in human resource and infrastructure that helps young people in India be passionate about space, and think of building things that are using satellites and rockets and so on. So that's that in itself takes several decades of work. So except India and China, for example, there's hardly any other developing country that has been successful in establishing a really good space program, right? The Brazilians have tried it. There's so many other countries that have in the developing country realm. Even, for example, South Africa is trying to do some of it as well. There's many other countries that are in the developing world, but that have tried to establish a space program and have not achieved this kind of success that India and China have achieved. So that talks about the ingenious people that that ISRO has and so on. But again, these are very kind of early days where we have established a certain amount of technology and a certain amount of manpower and infrastructure. Now the question is, how effectively can we use this to create economic development for the people and social development of the people, and how is the integration for this to benefit the country.
That's so interesting because I think with ISRO and the Chandrayaan, how would you define? There could be, I mean, there may be so many areas, or there be so many different combinations that come together. But would there be something easy for our listeners to know what was unique about Chandrayaan? So, how was it able to achieve what it did when nobody else could do? So, is there some specific technical or breakthrough idea that was used?
So, I guess both the Chandrayaan and Mangalyaan unique missions are kind of quite unique, because Chandrayaan and Mangalyaan, in my view, are not very space science oriented missions, but more as technology demonstration missions. So essentially, with Chandrayaan, for example, you had payloads from multiple countries, which enabled a collaboration between India and several of these countries for India to provide the vehicle where these other payloads can be accommodated alongside some Indian payloads, and that enabled the discovery of the water molecules on the moon, for example, right? So again, in the case of Mangalyaan, these are very strategic decision making on how we will approach the mission, because essentially this is the first time that India is kind of trying to do, and they limited the scope of the mission to having to attain the orbit around Mars and putting a spacecraft there. So you could then focus on having the technology on having engines, for example, fire at the right time, having navigation capabilities that could see that your spacecraft was could be tracked and could be communicated with at that distances. So those were the first attempts, because sending a spacecraft at 500 kilometers to 36,000 kilometers to then 300,000 kilometers, which is the moon, for example, they are kind of different in terms of being able to communicate with them and being able to track them and being able to operate them and so on. And in case of Mars, it becomes even more complicated because you have a 20-minute time lag. So the spacecraft must be kind of autonomous. So you need to build the spacecraft to be intelligent enough so that it can take some of the decisions on its own. And so those are things that were the building blocks of all of this. But now the question is that as these missions have given us the technology platform and have made us to secure this mindset, or this showcase the success that we are able to build interplanetary missions. Now the question is, are we going to build missions that are going to look at new evidence, new science, new things that people have not seen or discovered yet?
Right. And I think one of that would also be something that was in the news, I think, recently, where ISRO received. ISRO was involved in the Highland Soil Stimulant for future lunar missions. I think that was quite an achievement as well.
Yeah, that's essentially, I guess, they found some place in Tamil Nadu where some of the soil could be, simulant to the moon, and they are just trying to, I guess, use that to, do some tests for the rover that they want to put up on the moon.
Very interesting. I thought that was interesting. What about how are we going with the Gaganiyan mission? I mean, I know that currently, I don't know if training is still on. It's in Russia, if I'm not mistaken, and probably it stopped because of the corona. Do you have any background on that, and what do we plan? Probably that's going to be the first time we are sending humans into space, right? So, like you were just saying, you're looking at something new. You're looking at a new avenue. Does that satisfy you as a new avenue, Narayan?
Not really, to be very honest with you. Of course, we had sent, Rakesh Sharma as the first Indian cosmonaut to
Right.
space, but that was through the Russian collaboration. But then this whole Gaganyan mission, I think the biggest aspect to that is the more motivational and inspirational aspect of inspiring young people to look at space and science and technology and be inspired by such a feat. But beyond that, I think human spaceflight missions are very expensive, and the dividends of human spaceflight mission takes quite a long time to seep into the society. Quite, of course, there's multiple examples where technology built for human spaceflight have been used in the society, but of course it takes its own time. But then for a country like India, I think there's quite a lot of opportunity to integrate just satellite based services into many of the sectors like agriculture or energy or infrastructure. There's so much to do that in my personal opinion, I think those might be more beneficial, because you can first lift your people out of poverty using technology, and in the support and using space as a tool in creating economic value and economic development for people, and then look at all of these other things.
Right. And what about this? There was also talk about the space docking experiment that would be conducted within the next couple of years, maybe at ISRO. Is that to do with launch facilities, and is space docking a very integral part of this, or do we need to develop that, or are we dependent on somebody else for that?
So this space docking is interesting in two perspectives. One is if India decides to build a space station, and there's a station that is flying around the Earth, and you have the crew that is going in and coming out. So every time you have to go in, then you have to dock with the station. And so
Right.
the technology can be used for such a scenario where India plans to have a space station, and we will use this technology to home into kind of the station and dock there. The second bit is if India wants to do any kind of in orbit servicing, which is basically refueling its satellites up in orbit, like military satellites, military aircraft, for example, gets refueled up in air, for example. A similar scenario can also be looked at from space, where, for example, last month, I think one of the US companies demonstrated refueling a satellite up in space.
Right, right, correct.
So yeah, essentially, that's the two different angles that I see. Of course, there's also a military angle to this. If, for example, you want to, look at approaching a military target that you have, and want to do some kind of scouting around it, or want to grab it, or you want to capture some of it, or so on. So it could be used militarily as well. So there's that angle to this.
Right. And does the ASAT test, is it in line with the same thing? Because that did talk about the ability using that technology to target objects in space.
So the military test that the ASAT test is more about demonstrating that India too has the capability to target satellites, because the Chinese had done that in 2007, and
Right.
there was this there was talks in India that there could be laws that prevent India to do such tests in the future. Because what happened is with nuclear tests, for example, after the US, Russia, and some other countries did nuclear tests, immediately there was an international ban on nuclear tests, and other countries could not do it, and there would be sanctions on countries doing it. So essentially, the whole thing about anti-satellite tests is that people in the international policy making and lawmakers, they thought that after a couple of countries have demonstrated anti-satellite tests like US and Russia, and even now the Chinese had done, that there would be an international law saying that people will not be allowed to do anti-satellite tests in space. So this was the kind of the baseline or the foundation based on which the Indian government had to take a call if it wanted to do the ASAT tests or not. And it did do this after 13 years, or maybe I think 12 years after the Chinese did.
Yeah, and the like you were mentioning earlier when it comes to probably ISRO, I think there was a great announcement that came out last week by the government where ISRO facilities could be used by players in the private space. And I just want to come to this particular topic right now, because I'm sure there are a lot of starry-eyed young listeners. At the same time, there are people who are interested in developing or moving into this particular area. This announcement is huge because you will have support and facilities. I think besides launch facilities, sharing of data will become very important, so people can have access to that while they are performing these experiments. But just moving a gear towards the private sector now, what are the opportunities you see here? People listening to you, guys who have always been interested in getting into the space field, which are the areas you see that will open up, and how big is this announcement?
I think it's a massive change from the legacy, because earlier there was no real government policy or acknowledgement of private space sector as a potential in creating a new industry altogether. Because when you look at it from comparing to industries, I believe space industry has the same potential as how the IT industry or the biotech industry in India took off. Because we have all the infrastructure, we have the manpower, we have a lot of skill, a lot of enthusiastic people trying to do entrepreneurial stuff. So I think the timing of it is still late, because this could have been done maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and many more people could have done a lot of things by then. But then it's not too late as well, where today, these announcements are coming, but we'll have to see how it's implemented and how this is going to pass on benefits to the industry.
Right. And you would also be, I'm sure there are a lot of people at the moment who are talking about these opportunities, how this is actually going to open up or help in this particular space. And for people who are listening to us, I think they would also be interested in knowing, we were talking earlier when it came down to ISRO about the future missions that it plans. And you said it has to be futuristic as well. Do you have any suggestions that you would put on the table that we are not thinking about currently, but should be thought about? Something that's close to your heart, or something that you strongly believe in is something that needs to be part of the agenda?
Yeah, I think, at the moment, we have not integrated space as much as we could do with all the sectors that need development. So, for example, one of the companies that I had a chat with last month is using satellite data to help fishermen. They have an app where they tell fishermen where the fish is, and they could safely navigate there, and they also give them feed on the current weather so that fishermen don't get stuck in waters and their life is not under threat in the seas. And at the same time, they help fishermen to also access the market, where once they have their catch, they can sell their catch in the marketplace. So you see that they use satellite data in such an inventive way, where they use satellite positioning to give them the location, the satellite image data to tell them where the fish is. So you have an overall benefit where you have affected the life and safety of the fishermen. You've increased the catch by 50% because instead of them going randomly to places to get their fish, they know exactly where the fish is. And at the same time, you've affected the environment because studies show that the fuel consumption becomes less because you know where you're going in the ocean, right? And you also access the market. So you see that this forms the foundation of how technology can be used to affect change and give economic development to the most basic industries or sectors. So this is just an example from the fisheries sector, and you could have multiple sectors in in agriculture for farmers. It could be for several other sectors that you could think about, and do a very deep integration of technology helping those sectors, and creating value for all of them. And I think that that is something that we kind of need to focus on in the next 10 or 15 years, where we can become leaders in how space is used as a tool in economic development.
That's such an inspiring story, actually. Just listening to you, I was trying to picture it with what you were saying about that's actually very true with, how technology and space technology can actually be used to bring practical benefits to people right here on the ground. That's absolutely amazing. And earlier we did speak about Blue Origin. We spoke about SpaceX. Why don't you tell us something that maybe smaller companies are doing today? There are interesting things on the horizon. You want to tell us anything that you think or is coming out that a particular group, an organization, a private company is doing that you find interesting?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of interesting companies in India that are coming up, in that sense. For example, I see a company, for example, called Satsure, which is based in Bangalore, and they are trying to integrate the whole of space data into the farming sector, where essentially they can solve the problem of getting farmers, access to finances through institutional money. As we know, for example, still in India, about 30-40% of the banking happens outside of the institutions, where people are borrowing from landlords, or essentially villagers are depending on high interest rate loans that they take personally from not from banks, but from landlords within their villages, so for example, right? So and for example, the problem there is that the banks, they don't have any basis to make decisions on how the credit worthiness of a farmer is, for example. And they are trying to come up with models where they are going to look at satellite data for the last 7 years on the farm that the farmer comes from, and look at how productive that farm is, and then try to create a risk index on how good or bad that loan can be. And if the farmer says, I'm going to grow rice in this season here, they can do an analysis on how productive that land has been in the last 7 years, and tell the bank, for example, how risky this investment is. So the banks can use that as a basis of decision making. And this is for the first time such scientific evidence can be used in the whole decision making process. So for example, there's another company in Delhi called Blue Sky Analytics that is trying to create a kind of a Bloomberg for air quality data. So they're trying to use space and ground-based sensors to come up with indexes that look at air quality around different localities, and how that can be integrated into several sectors, be it insurance or policy making or so on. And then you could look at how to improving the air quality around major Indian cities, which are all extremely polluted, right? So and I already gave you the example of the fishermen. So there are all these companies that are coming up, and some of the companies that are trying to build rockets like Skyroot and Agnikul, and some of the companies trying to build satellites like Pixel and Kava Space or Dhruva Space, for example. All of these people can kind of come together to complement kind of each other, and build this so that the end goal is to service these kind of challenges in the country.
And that's really true, because the reason I wanted you to mention certain names and why I wanted to get into that was I just hope people get inspired we need more participation. We need more people to think that, like other companies right here, you could contribute as well. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who, after listening to you speaking, there's definitely going to be some action on their side, if not moving towards concrete action, then to understand a little bit more about the sector and how they can contribute. So to just come back to what you mentioned earlier, something just struck me, where you said the last 7 years data would be checked regarding satellite, through satellite data about the crops. How would, considering the current climate changes and conditions, which seem to be changing every second day, does the weather patterns also be taken into account?
Yeah, weather is actually a huge part of it, and that is also a place where satellite data affects quite a bit, because the weather
Correct.
is a very dynamic phenomena, and you need both ground-based, air-based, and space-based sensors to kind of bring models to it.
Sorry, I think if after human emotion, I would put weather right there. If you can control these two things, you can control a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And even like you said, with the future, do you see in the next, let's say, 10 to 12 years? So if I would have asked somebody 10, 12 years ago, there are certain careers that nobody would have dreamt were giving you this kind of results. For example, data scientist, data mining, somebody who's into coding. Where do you see this particular field, and what do you think are going to be specific skill sets or job opportunities that people can develop that you see opening up that are not yet there, they are on the horizon, but you see these specific areas could turn out into lucrative career options for people?
Right. Again, we could take an inspiration from an established sector like the aviation sector. In the beginning, the fighter pilots were the only ones who were flying a lot of these aircrafts, and the civilian pilots came up, and you had flying schools teaching how to fly. So all of that happened in the aviation sector, and then you had entrepreneurs thinking that they would run aviation and use buy aircraft and run their own airline and sell tickets where they could ferry people, and then you had airports built where people thought there'd be a lot of commerce of people traveling between airports, and they could buy and sell stuff in those airports and have economic activity going. And you had cabin crew who were professional, and you created a whole job sector just for the cabin crew itself. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that as the industry grows, the number of opportunities and the number of jobs and the nature of jobs will also evolve, and there'll be a tremendous amount of new opportunities that will come up. We all think that either astrophysicists or scientists or engineers who are trying to build rockets are mostly the end of the job phenomena in the space sector, but that's not the case. If you imagine the industry having evolved to a certain extent, you could imagine having tremendously different kinds of jobs being created. And I was just fascinated to see, for example, there was an announcement I think I saw on Twitter saying we are looking for somebody who can handle the psychology of space tourists, and that's a job that somebody was advertising for.
You're going to have space caterers. You're going to have space food, uniforms. I think you're right. There's going to be so much that's going to come out of this, right?
Yeah, it all, as industry evolves, new jobs coming in and new things need to be done. It all depends on how you're going to get the economic activity going, and how you're going to get more people involved in space and more activity going. And I think that will eventually create all these kinds of new opportunities.
So Narayan, before we let you go here at Indian Genes, I think you've been extremely patient. Your information has been engrossing to all of us here, and we're hoping we could probably talk to you again. Let us know, please, Narayan, what do you plan to do moving forward? If you can share with us where do you see yourself going, and what are you going to get involved in? Anything that you would like to put out, or if people want to listen to you again, listen more about you. I do know that you are running the very, very interesting, and that's something I follow as well, the New Space India podcast. That's an excellent podcast, and I definitely recommend all my listeners to please go there. What would you like to tell our listeners, Narayan?
Sure. So, firstly, thank you again for the opportunity to come as a guest and speak my mind. Often I'm the host and I'm asking questions, but essentially, I think my goal is to see a very vibrant space community in India to expand the horizon from just the whole ISRO realm to also having the it could be schools, it could be colleges, it could be industry, it could be NGOs, it could be many other groups, amateur groups, all participating in space much more, so that the benefits of it are passed down to the society. And the New Space India platform, as you said, is a community where we are trying to create this enthusiasm. And about 10 years ago, when we were looking at all of this, there were hardly any traditional there were mostly traditional SMEs in India who were serving ISRO and the space program. But in the last 10 years, we've had 30 or 40 startups come in the sector in India, and that's a big change. And will we see the change from 0 to 30 or 30 to 40 in 10 years? Can we see a change of 40 to 400 in the next 10 years? And that's very exciting, because as young people will come in, new skills will come, and new enthusiasm will come, and then there's lots of new resources available for them. And you can see that 10 years ago, the venture capitalists were hardly participating in the space sector in India. Today, there's people who are putting in lots of money into the sector and funding these ideas that were considered crazy 10 years ago. But today, those venture capitalists are funding some of these companies. And when we see more such people fund new crazy ideas in the next 10 years, those are very, very, very exciting things and interesting things that are going to happen in the next few years. And I'm hoping that we will see, in the future, where India is like any other sector, where you have Indian industry being successful in the pharmaceutical world. For example, Indian companies are shipping medicines to 150 countries in the world. I want to see a day where Indian space companies are doing business with 150 countries in the world and creating products and services that impact the whole world.
Totally agree with you. And Narayan, we at Indian Genes as well, for you, for your colleagues, in whatever way you want to use this platform, if you ever want to, if any of y'all ever want to pass a message out there, we are always open, because like you said, or we said at the very beginning, the idea here is to generate interest. That's what we can do. The experts can do the magic. I don't think I can do any magic, but I can definitely put you guys out there, communicate with as many people as should be, and create a buzz. Like you said, it's the initial stage, but that's when the buzz needs to be pushed. We are trying our best as well. And from everybody here, Narayan, at Indian Genes, it has been a very engrossing time. I thank you for your patience. I know earlier we had some technical difficulties, but we are hoping that we will keep connected, Narayan, and maybe you're going to come back and talk to us again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a real pleasure, and I think it's also very motivating for me to kind of speak to you, and it's very good to see enthusiasm from you as well, and and I thank you for your efforts in putting out such interesting and insightful material in the world out there, and which will possibly inspire even one person inspired by this is one more person added to the world. And again, thank you very much, and I'm happy to chat with you at any given point of time in the future.
Thank you very much, Narayan. Thank you, and hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.